Hey guys, this is Shane here from Echo Soundworks. In this video, I'm going to show you how you can make a Reese bass like this one in pretty much any synthesizer. And it's a detuned saw sound that has showed up in pretty much every genre. I've heard it in pop, trap, hip hop, R&B, house, future bass, you name it, it's probably been there. So I'm going to show you how to make this type of sound in a few different synths in this video. I'm going to be popping back and forth because I was thinking, instead of showing you how to do it in just one synth like Serum or Anna 2 or Massive X, whatever it might be, I wanted to give you a recipe to be able to make basic Reese basses in pretty much any synth. So let's just get into Logic, open up a synth, and get going. All right, so the first synth we're going to be using is Serum. Now, I'm using Serum first because it will show you what I'm actually doing. Its visual feedback is off the charts for a synth, so you'll be able to see and hear what I'm explaining. Now, step one is to load up a saw wave, and it doesn't have to be a basic saw. It could be a pulse width saw, it could be a saw wavetable in Serum or Massive X or Pigments, whatever it might be. But you want to make sure whatever you choose that it has that buzzy, bright harmonic content on the high end that a saw waveform gives you. So even if you play it at like a low range, like we'll do C1, it has all that buzz. You need that buzz because you're going to filter out some of it, then distort it, and that's what helps make the Reese have that Reese sound. So sine wave, triangle waves generally aren't good as a starting point for Reese basses. Now, next you're going to add voices of unison. Now, every synth's going to have this, and I like to work with odd voices of unison because it is a bass after all, and when you have an odd voice count with voices of unison, you're always going to have a voice directly in the middle. So look at these blue lines. So the blue line is my main voice in the middle, and 2, there's no voice in the middle. So you can see on my phase correlation meter that I go to anti-phase a lot with 2. It just goes back and forth. Now, a 3, you might think, well, you're adding more voices and you kept the detune where it's at. So you might think, it would make sense to think that the phase would be worse. Well, it's not going to be worse because that center voice. It actually starts in, not in anti-phase, right? It starts towards the positive side of our phase correlation meter. Whereas with 2, it literally just starts in anti-phase, right? So that's why I like using odd voice counts, because there's going to be 1 in the middle, and this is a bass after all. Now, if you're worried about phasing issues and monocompatibility, what you can do is you can just carve out the low end of the Reese bass once it's made, and then layer that with a dedicated monophonic sub. So lots of ways to combat that, but yeah, I like 5, 7, and 9, but you can use even voice counts if your synth doesn't have odd voice counts, but the higher the number, generally the better. So every synth's going to have a detune or spread knob, and that's going to spread out the voices of unison. And then a lot of them will have a blend or a mix, and that's going to basically mix the volume of the superimposed digital voices with the actual voice that's there. So if I take the blend all the way down, it basically sounds like it's, a mono sound. All right, so I'm just going to stick with 7, and we're going to turn this down a little bit, and this would be a good starting point. All right, so for the next step, the filtering part of the process, I've pulled up Arturia Pigments 2. Now we're very quickly going to create where we basically left off in Serum. So I'm going to change the sound to a saw wavetable, or say saw waveform within this wavetable, and we're going to turn on some voices of unison. It's that simple. All right, so for the filter, let's go and we're going to select a low pass filter. Now, when you're working with Reese basses, something you want to be aware of is that you don't necessarily, most often or more often than not, you're not going to want to use a low pass 6 or 12. And those numbers stand for the decibels per octave that are going to be attenuated in the filter. So I'll show you what I mean. So we'll set our filter to about halfway on LP6. And now we're going to go to LP24. So So what this allows me to do is I can actually turn my cutoff up a little bit more to get more of that mid-range tone. Without introducing too many of the high frequencies back in. Now, if I keep the cutoff right where this is and go to the LP6, we're gonna hear a lot more high frequency content. Right, and now it doesn't sound like a Reese bass. It's more of like a kind of a mid-bass saw sound. All right, so now we're working in Anna 2. So this is the third synth we've pulled up in the video. Now it looks a little bit different if you're thinking, hey, that doesn't look like Anna 2. This is a skin that I've been working on, and yeah, I had loaded up by default, so here it is. But yeah, so next step, what you want to do is you want to introduce some more kind of grit and some type of character back into the Reese bass, because basically at its core it's a detuned saw that's filtered out. Now this is what I referenced in the intro, that it's really easy to make just a basic filtered saw bass. It's a little bit harder to make an interesting one that fits the emotional character of your track. So one way to do that is to introduce some saturation or drive after you've filtered out the highs. So something really interesting happens when you do that. Because you filtered out the high frequencies, you're not saturating, a really high, buzzy, harmonically rich content that would be there in a saw waveform. It's adding these kind of mid-range harmonics, which is pretty cool. So a lot of synths have a drive in the filter. Anna 2 does, which we're looking at right now. Serum does. A lot of synths do. So if your synth has a drive, mess around with that. You can get some cool results with it. If it doesn't, you can always go third party or a stock saturation plugin in your DAW. So here's our Reese bass in Anna 2. It's a little quiet right now. Now listen to the difference when I add some drive. So what you might have to do is you might have to go back and forth between the two and turn your cutoff down a little bit more than maybe where you had it set, because the drive is going to introduce some more high frequency content. But as a whole, you don't want a huge amount of high frequencies in your Reese bass, because it's going to sound more like a mid bass at that point. So here's what it looks like right now on a spectrum analyzer. Okay, so we've jumped back into Serum, and I'm going to show you something that I've referenced a couple times in this video. So if you're worried about the low end being a super saw type sound and having voices of unison, what you can do is in your synth, you can go to an EQ or another filter, and you can take out some of the lows, like the real low frequencies. So we'll take this to about, I don't know, 45 hertz for now. So basically, we're taking out the sub range. So if we pull up FabFilter Pro Q3 again, let's a little bit higher. So now what you can do in your synth, or you can layer it, you layer in a sub layer. So in Serum, I'll just turn on our sub, and I'm going to hit direct out. Right, that's really all you have to do. Now, those two sounds together. Are going to sound very similar, but the real low end is now tighter in terms of our phase correlation. So if I pull up the phase correlation meter and we turn off our oscillator with the saw waveform, and here's just our sub, it's pinged up at, it's a mono sound. We did direct out, so it's not going through the filter. So that's how you can get that tight, really tight sub low end with your, with your Reese bass. All right, so the last thing we're going to look at is how to make the sound a little bit more interesting. So I'm just going to throw out a bunch of tips and tricks that I found making Reese bass presets over the years. So one thing you can do is you can modulate the detune, the blend of the voices, the filter cutoff, the drive, and you can even introduce some noise, maybe a white noise, maybe kind of a weird random noise. There's a lot of different things you can do. And then of course you can layer in another type of oscillator or another type of sound. So let's quickly do those things now. So I'm going to take a LFO here and we're going to pop it onto our filter, and I'm going to make sure it's bipolar, meaning it's going left and right as opposed to unidirectional. I don't want like a wub wub feel. But what I do want is some slight movement. So I'm going to take a shape that is kind of a weird shape, but we're just going to make it very subtle. I just want a little bit of movement here and there as the sound progresses, but I don't want a wub wub feel. All right, so if you're working in a synth that's a wavetable synth like Serum or Pigments or Anna 2, you're gonna have ways to manipulate the waveform and bend it. So you can mess around with bend plus, bend minus, sync, pulse width modulation's a cool one. Again, you can modulate this with an envelope or an LFO and just add some movement to the sound. All right, so I loaded up a noise sample, and it just adds a little bit of ambience and character to the sound. And lastly, let's look at layering in a whole other type of waveform. So let's go to one of our free wavetable packs. Let's go to Deep Saw. We sampled these sounds from a lot of modular synths. So let's just listen to what it sounds like in isolation here. So it's a really cool kind of a... All right, so I added a couple more voices of unison. It's cranked up to 11 now. We added some sync to add a little bit of almost like a fifth vibe to it. And that's just being layered with our main sound. All right, so that's going to sum up this video. If you guys have any questions or comments, you can post those below and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. If you guys aren't subscribed to our channel, you know the drill. Hit that subscribe button. The support really does mean a lot to us. And if you guys haven't ever checked out our website, echosoundworks.com, definitely head on over there. There's a ton of free content, samples, loops, and presets. And of course, there's some premium sound sets and sample packs as well. And lastly, if you guys use Instagram, consider giving us a follow. We run a lot of contests, giveaways, and promotions on that platform. And I think you guys will like what we're doing over there. All right, thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.